The key jingled in my hand as I opened the door to my new place. My heart pounded with excitement. After months of saving every penny from my entry-level job, I finally had my own apartment. Sure, it was only 400 square feet, but it was mine. My family had insisted on seeing it the day I moved in. I thought they'd be proud of me for taking this big step at 22. Mom, Dad, my older brother Marcus, and my sister Ashley crowded into the tiny space. The silence was deafening. Mom wrinkled her nose like she smelled something rotten. Ashley burst out laughing first. "This place is smaller than my closet," she shrieked, holding her stomach as she doubled over. Marcus shook his head slowly. "How do you even turn around in here?" Dad just stood there with his arms crossed, looking disappointed. The same look he gave me when I chose community college over the expensive university he wanted. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. This was supposed to be my moment of independence, my first real step into adulthood. Instead, I felt like I was 5 years old again, being laughed at for something I was proud of. We went to dinner at a fancy restaurant afterward. The kind of place my family loved to show off at. They ordered expensive steaks while I stuck to a salad, still watching my budget carefully after the security deposit. That's when the real show began. Mom started bragging about their new kitchen renovation. "The island alone cost more than most people's rent," she said, cutting into her steak. "We had to expand the whole space. The old kitchen felt so cramped." Ashley jumped in next. "My apartment has a walk-in closet bigger than, well, you know." She glanced at me with a smirk. "Some people's entire living spaces." Marcus couldn't resist adding his 2 cents. "At least when I bring dates over, we don't have to climb over the bed to get to the bathroom." Everyone laughed except me. Dad raised his wine glass. "To success," he announced. "To making smart choices that lead to a comfortable life." The message was clear. I wasn't successful. My choices weren't smart. My life wasn't comfortable. I sat there, picking at my salad, wishing I could disappear. But something else was building inside me too. A quiet anger that would soon change everything. The attacks continued throughout dinner. Every conversation somehow circled back to my situation. "The thing is," Marcus said, wiping his mouth with the cloth napkin, "location matters. You can't build wealth in a place like that." "Exactly," Ashley agreed. "I mean, what's your exit strategy? You can't bring anyone home to that space." I tried to defend myself. "It's just temporary. I'm building up my savings, and—" "Honey," Mom interrupted, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was a child. "We're just worried about you. This isn't sustainable." "Face it," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with that superior smile he'd perfected since high school. "You're failing. That isn't a real home. It's a storage unit with a bed." Dad nodded approvingly at his son's harsh words. Sometimes people need to hear the truth, even when it hurts. The truth? The truth was that I worked 2 jobs to afford that place. The truth was that I paid my own bills while Ashley still lived at home rent-free. The truth was that my tiny apartment represented more independence than any of them had shown at my age. But I didn't say any of that. I just sat there and took it, like I always did. That night, after they dropped me off at my building, I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my tiny apartment. I put my key in the lock, and for the first time since I'd gotten the place, I felt ashamed to walk inside. I looked around at my studio with fresh eyes. The bed took up most of the space. The kitchen was just a mini fridge, a hot plate, and a microwave on a small counter. The bathroom was so narrow I had to turn sideways to get past the toilet. They were right. It was small. It was cramped. It probably was smaller than Ashley's closet. I sat on my bed and cried. Not because my apartment was tiny, but because the people who should have been cheering me on had torn me down instead. My own family had made me feel like a failure for taking a brave step forward. The tears came hard and fast. All the excitement I'd felt about my independence vanished, replaced by doubt and humiliation. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I should have just stayed home longer, saved up for something bigger. But as the tears slowed, something else stirred inside me. A tiny spark of defiance that would soon grow into a roaring flame. I woke up the next morning with swollen eyes but a clearer mind. As I made coffee on my hot plate, I looked around my space again. Yes, it was small. But you know what else it was? Mine. Nobody could tell me what to do here. Nobody could criticize my choices or make me feel small. I didn't have to ask permission to paint the walls or move furniture around. I didn't have to listen to lectures about my life decisions over breakfast. Standing in that tiny kitchen, I made myself a promise. This apartment may be small, but it was the foundation of something bigger. And one day, my family would regret every joke, every cruel comment, every moment they made me feel ashamed of my independence. I didn't know how yet, but I knew it would happen. I pulled out a notebook and started making plans. If they wanted to judge my home, I'd give them something worth looking at. If they thought I was failing, I'd prove them wrong in ways they couldn't ignore. The apartment they mocked would become my launching pad. And when success came, I'd remember every person who believed in me, and every person who didn't. The war was on, even if they didn't know it yet. That weekend, I threw myself into transforming my space. I'd saved up a small emergency fund, and I decided to invest some of it in making my apartment truly mine. I started with paint. The landlord had left the walls a depressing beige, but he'd said I could paint as long as I returned it to original condition when I moved out. I chose a warm, sage green for the main wall and crisp white for the others. It made the space feel bigger immediately. Next came furniture. I scoured thrift stores, estate sales, and Facebook Marketplace. I found a beautiful vintage mirror for $15 that made the room look twice as large. A small bookshelf became a room divider between my sleeping and living areas. I bought plants everywhere I could fit them. Pothoes hanging from the ceiling, a snake plant in the corner, herbs growing on my windowsill. The place started to feel alive. The transformation was incredible. What had once felt like a cramped box now felt like a cozy sanctuary. Every corner served multiple purposes. My bed had storage underneath. My coffee table had shelves for books and magazines. As I worked, I felt something I hadn't expected: pride. This wasn't just decorating. This was proving to myself that I could create something beautiful with very little money and a lot of creativity. 3 weeks later, my family invited themselves over again. I'd been posting some pictures of my space on social media, and Ashley had made sarcastic comments about my home improvement project. They knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon. I opened it with confidence this time, excited to show off what I'd accomplished. "Wow," Mom said as she stepped inside. "It's different." Ashley walked around slowly, taking in the changes. "Cute," she admitted reluctantly. "But still, tiny." Marcus sat on my small couch and looked around appraisingly. "I guess you can polish a turd," he said with a shrug. But I could see something different in their eyes this time. They weren't laughing as hard. Dad actually complimented the paint color, though he quickly added that the space was still too small for a real adult. I smiled and offered them coffee, but inside, the fire was growing stronger. Their comments didn't hurt as much this time because I could see the truth. They were a little impressed, and that made them uncomfortable. Good. Let them be uncomfortable. This was just the beginning. A month later, everything changed. I was having coffee with my parents when Dad's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, and I could hear his voice getting more strained with each passing minute. When he came back to the table, his face was pale. "That was the bank," he said quietly. Mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "What did they say?" "The adjustable rate mortgage just reset. Our payment is going up by $1,200 a month." The silence was deafening. I watched my parents' faces as the reality sank in. The beautiful house they were so proud of, the one they used to make me feel small about my apartment, was becoming a financial nightmare. "Can we refinance?" Mom asked hopefully. Dad shook his head. "Not with the market the way it is now. The house lost value, and we owe more than it's worth." I sipped my coffee and said nothing, but my mind was racing. The same parents who had mocked my cheap rent were now drowning in mortgage debt. The irony was almost too perfect. "We'll figure something out," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. As I walked home to my tiny apartment that night, I couldn't help but smile. The foundation they'd built their superiority on was starting to crack. If you're enjoying this story of sweet revenge, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales like this one. The cracks in my family's perfect facade started showing everywhere. 2 weeks after my parents' mortgage revelation, Marcus called me. He never called me unless he needed something, so I knew it wasn't good news. "Hey," he said, his usual cocky tone replaced by something that almost sounded like worry. "Can we grab lunch?" We met at a small cafe near his office. Marcus looked tired, and his expensive suit seemed a little wrinkled. The confident swagger he usually carried was nowhere to be seen. "I might lose my job," he admitted over his sandwich. "The company's downsizing, and I'm one of the newer hires." I tried to look sympathetic, but internally, I was processing the irony. This was the same brother who had called my apartment a storage unit, who had mocked my entry-level position and careful budgeting. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said genuinely. "What's your backup plan?" He laughed bitterly. "Backup plan?" I've been living paycheck to paycheck trying to keep up with the lifestyle. The apartment, the car payments, the credit cards. I thought the job was secure. Suddenly, his jokes about my cheap rent didn't sound so clever. My careful financial planning didn't look so naive anymore. "I might need to move somewhere smaller," he admitted quietly. "Somewhere affordable." I nodded sympathetically, but inside, I was thinking, welcome to the real world, Marcus. While my family's world was falling apart, mine was getting better every day. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning. I walked in expecting another project assignment, but instead, she offered me a promotion. The company had noticed my hard work and reliability, and they wanted to move me up to a coordinator position with a 20% salary increase. I accepted immediately, trying to keep my excitement professional. But inside, I was celebrating. This promotion would give me financial breathing room I'd never had before. The first thing people asked when they heard about my raise was whether I'd move to a bigger place. Even my coworkers assumed I'd want to upgrade immediately. But here's the thing that nobody understood: I loved my tiny apartment. It had taught me that happiness wasn't about square footage. It was about creating a space that reflected who you were, not what you thought you should be. My small rent meant I could save most of my raise. While my family was drowning in expenses, I was building wealth. While they were trapped by their lifestyle choices, I had flexibility and freedom. That night, I celebrated in my cozy sanctuary with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. My tiny apartment had become the foundation of my success, not an obstacle to it. Mother Nature decided to join my revenge story in the most dramatic way possible. The storm hit on a Thursday night. I watched from my third-floor window as rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling so loudly it rattled my windows. The weather service had been talking about it for days, but nobody expected it to be this severe. By Friday morning, half the city was underwater. The river that ran behind my parents' neighborhood had overflowed its banks, sending flood water rushing through the expensive houses that lined the area. My phone started buzzing with family updates. Mom texted first: "Basement flooded. Lost everything down there." Then Dad: "Insurance adjuster can't come out for 3 days. Water damage is extensive." Ashley's message made me actually laugh out loud: "OMG, the smell is horrible. We can't stay here." Their beautiful house, the one they were so proud of, had become unlivable. The finished basement where Dad had his office and Mom stored her holiday decorations was completely destroyed. The hardwood floors on the main level were warping from the moisture. Meanwhile, I sat in my third-floor apartment, completely dry and comfortable, watching the chaos unfold below. The tiny apartment they'd mocked was now looking like a pretty smart choice. The universe has quite a sense of humor sometimes. The phone call came at 9 p.m. on Friday. I recognized Mom's number but almost didn't answer. I was enjoying a quiet evening in my perfectly dry, perfectly cozy apartment. "Hello?" "Sweetie," Mom's voice sounded strained and tired. "I know this is awkward, but I need to ask you a favor." I waited, already knowing what was coming. "The house is unlivable right now. The smell from the flood water is overwhelming, and we can't run the heater because of the moisture. The hotel is so expensive, and with everything else going on." She paused, and I could hear the difficulty in her voice. "Can we crash at your place for just one night? I know it's small, but we're desperate." The same woman who had called my apartment unlivable just a few months ago was now asking to live in it. The place she had wrinkled her nose at was suddenly looking like a sanctuary. I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the irony. "Of course," I finally said. "Family helps family, right?" But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile. The tables were turning faster than I had ever imagined possible. They arrived at my door looking like refugees from their own privileged lives. Mom carried an overnight bag, her hair still perfectly styled despite everything. Dad looked exhausted and older than I'd seen him before. Ashley clutched her designer purse like a security blanket. When I opened the door, something had shifted. There were no jokes this time. No comments about the size of my space. They stepped into my warm, dry apartment with something I'd never seen from them before: gratitude. "Thank you so much, honey," Mom said, looking around with different eyes. "It's so cozy in here." Ashley sat carefully on my small couch, her usual sarcasm replaced by quiet observation. The fairy lights I'd strung around the windows cast a warm glow over everything. The plants made the air smell fresh and clean. The space I'd carefully curated felt like a haven compared to their flooded disaster. Marcus arrived last, having driven over from his apartment. He stepped inside and actually whistled softly. "This is really nice," he said, and for once, it didn't sound condescending. It sounded surprised. Dad stood by my window, looking out at the city lights. "You've done well here," he admitted quietly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was the sound of people recognizing they had been wrong. That night, as we tried to figure out sleeping arrangements in my 400 square feet, the real conversations began. Ashley was looking at my photos on the wall, pictures I'd taken around the city, small adventures from my independent life. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly while Mom and Dad discussed insurance claims in the kitchen area. "Do what?" "Live alone. Be independent. I mean, really independent." She gestured around the apartment. "I complain about this place, but I still live at home." "You actually did it." I sat down next to her on the couch. "It's scary at first," I admitted. "But there's something amazing about knowing you can take care of yourself." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think your landlord has any more units available? Something like this?" I nearly choked on my tea. "Why would you want a place smaller than your closet?" I asked, throwing her own words back at her. She had the decency to blush. "I deserve that," she said. I was being awful. "The truth is, this place has something I don't have in my big bedroom at Mom and Dad's." "What's that?" "It's yours. Really, completely yours. And that's beautiful." For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my real sister instead of the person she pretended to be. The next morning brought more revelations about my family's crumbling financial situation. Dad was on the phone with insurance companies while Mom made coffee on my hot plate. The same hot plate she had looked down on months ago was now providing the only warm breakfast they'd have. "The deductible is $8,000, Dad said after hanging up. "And that's just for the water damage. If the foundation has problems." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. They were looking at tens of thousands of dollars in repairs on a house they were already struggling to afford. Marcus had spent the night on my small couch, and he looked uncomfortable in more ways than one. As he folded up the blankets I'd given him, he asked the question that changed everything. "Do you think there are other apartments in this building?" I looked up from where I was making eggs on my hot plate. "Thinking of downsizing?" He ran his hand through his hair. "I might not have a choice. The job market is brutal, and even if I find something, it won't pay what I was making." The irony was delicious. My brother, who had called my place a storage unit, was now considering it a lifeline. "There's a one-bedroom opening up next month," I said casually. "Same building, second floor." His eyes lit up with interest. "How much?" When I told him the rent, he looked relieved for the first time in weeks. Over the following days, my family's situation continued to deteriorate. The flood had been the final blow to an already shaky financial foundation. Dad called a family meeting in my tiny living room. We all squeezed together on my small couch and the folding chair I'd bought at a garage sale. "We might lose the house," he said without preamble. "Even if insurance covers the flood damage, we can't make the new mortgage payments. We've been trying to keep up appearances, but the truth is, we've been living beyond our means for years." Mom started crying quietly. Ashley reached over and held her hand. Marcus just stared at the floor. "The market is terrible right now," Dad continued. "We're underwater on the mortgage. If we sell, we'll still owe money to the bank." I sat there processing this information. The family that had mocked. Meanwhile, my tiny apartment suddenly looked like a symbol of wisdom rather than failure. I had been building something sustainable while they had been building a house of cards. "What will you do?" I asked gently. Dad looked around my small space with new appreciation. "We'll have to find something smaller. Much smaller." The word "smaller" didn't sound like an insult anymore. It sounded like salvation. Marcus was the first one to swallow his pride completely. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening with pizza and a sheepish expression. "Can we talk?" he asked. I let him in, and he sat on my couch, the same couch he had made jokes about just months earlier. "I need help," he said simply. "I lost the job today." I sat down across from him and waited. "The apartment I mentioned, the one bedroom in this building? Is it still available?" I nodded. Would you mind putting in a good word with the landlord? Maybe helping me with the application process? I know it's a lot to ask, especially after how I treated you." This was the same brother who had told me I was failing. The same person who had called my home a storage unit. Now he was asking if he could sleep on my couch while he waited for an apartment in my building. "The couch is all yours," I said. "As long as you need it." The relief on his face was immediate and genuine. "Thank you," he said. "I know I don't deserve it." He was right. He didn't deserve it. But sometimes being the bigger person isn't about what people deserve, it's about who you choose to be. Still, the irony was too perfect to ignore completely. Within a week, my tiny apartment had become family headquarters for disaster recovery. Everyone was asking me for help with the very thing they had mocked me for, finding affordable housing. Ashley wanted to know about my neighborhood, what I paid for utilities, how I found furniture for cheap. Mom asked for tips on living in a small space. Dad inquired about my building's management company. They picked my brain about everything from budget grocery shopping to maximizing storage in small spaces. The same people who had made fun of my lifestyle choices were now desperately trying to learn from them. "How did you make peace with downsizing?" Mom asked one evening as she helped me cook dinner on my hot plate. "I never thought of it as downsizing," I replied, stirring the pasta. "I thought of it as right-sizing. Finding what actually mattered." She nodded thoughtfully. "We got so caught up in keeping up with everyone else that we forgot to think about what we actually needed." Dad was researching apartments on his laptop in my living area. These rent prices are actually reasonable, he said with surprise. I had no idea you could get so much for so little in this area. What he meant was, I had no idea you could live well without going broke trying to impress people. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. My tiny apartment had become their roadmap to financial recovery. Sitting in my kitchen one evening, watching my family plan their new, smaller lives, I had a moment of perfect clarity. The people who had mocked me were now fighting over scraps of what I had built for myself. Not literally fighting, but desperately trying to recreate the very lifestyle they had dismissed as inadequate. Marcus had gotten approval for the one-bedroom apartment downstairs and was asking me about furniture stores. Ashley was looking at studio apartments in the next neighborhood over. Mom and Dad were considering a two-bedroom rental that was smaller than their old living room. They weren't just asking for my help, they were asking for my permission to live like me. The lifestyle they had ridiculed had become their aspiration. I realized then that I had won something bigger than revenge. I had won respect. More than that, I had won the satisfaction of knowing that my choices had been vindicated by circumstances they never saw coming. The tiny apartment they once mocked had become the template for their survival. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong on purpose. Sometimes it's just being right and waiting for the world to prove it for you. The wheel had turned completely. The confession came on a quiet Sunday morning. We were all crammed into my kitchen, sharing coffee and pastries I'd picked up from the bakery downstairs. It was becoming a weekly tradition, family breakfast in the space they used to mock. Mom set down her coffee cup and looked directly at me. "We need to talk about something," she said. The conversation stopped. Ashley paused mid-bite of her croissant. Marcus looked up from his phone. Dad put down his newspaper. "We owe you an apology," Mom continued. "A big one." She looked around my apartment with completely different eyes than she had 6 months ago. "We were awful to you about this place. About your choices. About your independence." Dad nodded slowly. "We thought we knew better. We thought success looked like what we had, the big house, the expensive lifestyle, the debt we hid from everyone including ourselves." "You were the smart one all along," Ashley added quietly. "You were building something real while we were building something that looked good on the outside but was rotten inside." Marcus set down his coffee cup. "You had the courage to live within your means while we were living in denial. You were the adult in the room, and we treated you like a kid." The apology hung in the air for a moment. Then Mom reached across my small table and took my hand. "We shouldn't have mocked you. You were smarter than all of us." I didn't rub it in. That's not who I am, and besides, they already knew the truth. "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate you saying that." But internally, I was savoring this moment. The complete reversal of everything they had believed about success, about independence, about what it meant to be an adult. I poured everyone more coffee and smiled. "You know what the funny thing is? I was never trying to prove anything to you. I was just trying to build a life I could afford and enjoy." "That's what makes it even more impressive," Dad said. "You weren't performing success for anyone else. You were actually being successful." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our coffee in my tiny kitchen that somehow managed to fit all 5 of us around the small table. "I have a confession too," I said finally. "I love this place. Not just because it's mine, but because it taught me the difference between what I wanted and what I needed." Mom looked around at my carefully curated space. "It's beautiful," she said, and for the first time, I knew she meant it. "It's not about the size," Ashley said. "It's about the intention. Everything here has a purpose." They had finally learned what I'd figured out months ago. Home isn't about impressing other people. It's about creating a space that supports your actual life, not the life you think you're supposed to want. The shift in family dynamics was complete. Suddenly, I was the one giving advice. Me, the failure, who couldn't afford a real apartment. They listened to everything I said about budgeting, about living within means, about finding joy in simplicity. The same people who had lectured me about my choices now hung on my every word about theirs. How do you resist the urge to upgrade when you get a raise? Ashley asked. She had found a job and was looking at small apartments seriously now. I don't resist it, I explained. I just think carefully about whether the upgrade actually improves my life or just impresses other people. Marcus, who had moved into his one-bedroom downstairs, asked for decorating advice. How do you make a small space feel bigger? I showed him how mirrors and light colors could open up a room, how plants could bring life to corners, how multifunctional furniture could maximize space without sacrificing style. Dad wanted to know about my investment strategy. What do you do with the money you save on rent? I explained my simple approach: emergency fund first, then retirement savings, then a travel fund for experiences instead of stuff. Mom asked about meal planning in a tiny kitchen. I taught her about batch cooking and how to use a slow cooker to create variety without taking up counter space. They were learning from me. Finally, one evening, as we sat in my living room watching a movie on my small TV, Ashley said something that took my breath away. I wish I had what you have, she said quietly during a commercial break. What do you mean? Peace, she replied. Independence. The confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself. She looked around my tiny space with something that might have been envy. You're not pretending to be anything you're not. You're not living someone else's idea of success. You're just content. Marcus nodded from his spot on the floor. I spent so much energy trying to look successful that I never actually built anything lasting. I remember when you first got this place, Ashley continued. I laughed at it. But now I realize I was laughing at something I was afraid I could never have. What's that? The courage to be yourself instead of what everyone expects you to be. I remembered that first day, when she had compared my apartment to her closet. The shame I had felt, the tears I had cried. Now she was looking at my life like it was something to aspire to. The girl who had mocked my independence now wished she had the strength to claim her own. As my family rebuilt their lives in smaller, more sustainable ways, I realized I had some boundary setting to do. Marcus was settled in his apartment downstairs, but he still came up almost every day. Mom and Dad had found a lovely 2-bedroom rental and were slowly replacing their flood-damaged belongings with more modest alternatives. Ashley had moved into a studio across town and was learning to cook for herself for the first time. They all wanted to spend time in my space, drawn to the peace and simplicity they discovered there. But I needed to make something clear. I love having you all over, I said during one of our Sunday morning coffee sessions. But I need to set some expectations. They looked at me attentively. This is my home. My sanctuary. The place where I recharge and find peace. You're always welcome here, but there are rules now. I looked at each of them in turn. No more criticism. No more jokes about the size or my choices. No more unsolicited advice about what I should do with my money or my space. They nodded seriously. And if you want my help with anything, budgeting, decorating, finding apartments, you ask respectfully. You don't assume. You don't take advantage of my generosity just because I've been there for you during this crisis. Dad cleared his throat. That's completely fair. More than fair. We respect your boundaries, Mom added. And your wisdom. It felt good to set those limits. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted our relationships to be built on mutual respect instead of old patterns of dismissal and superiority. I turned back to my tiny apartment, my sanctuary, my launching pad, my proof that success isn't about size or status. The fairy lights cast a warm glow over everything. The plants rustled gently in the evening breeze from my open window. My space felt full of peace and possibility. The apartment they once mocked had become my throne. And now, instead of knocking it down, they were learning to build their own. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and waiting for others to recognize wisdom when they see it. Thanks for watching. If this story of turning mockery into victory inspired you, make sure to subscribe and share it with anyone who's ever been underestimated. Sometimes the smallest spaces hold the biggest dreams, and the sweetest revenge is simply proving that you were right all along.